Welcome back to Killer Bites. Thanks for joining me for another episode of True Crime. Today I'm going to cover American serial killer Tommy Lynn Sells, the man responsible for taking the lives of at least 22 people. This is also the story of Krystal Surles, a brave and determined 10-year-old, but I don't want to give away anything just yet. If you're ready to hear more about this case, keep on watching. On June 28, 1964 in Oakland, California, Tommy Lynn Sells and his twin sister Tammy Jean Sells were born. After only a year and a half, Tammy Jean died. The two had become sick with meningitis, but Tommy was the only one to survive. Once Tammy had passed away, Tommy's mother asked her sister Bonnie to take care of him. She was going through a difficult period of grief after losing her daughter and needed time to heal. Bonnie lived in Holcomb, Missouri, and grew very fond of Tommy. She felt like a mother figure to him, and she told Tommy that she had plans of adopting him. She was his main caretaker until he was 5 years old. Once Tommy's mother heard of Bonnie's plans to adopt her son, she felt the urge to take him back home. Shortly after, she brought him back to live with her and his other older siblings. Tommy's early life was chaotic. When he was just 7 years old, he started to use alcohol as a coping mechanism for his unstable home life. At 8 years old, Tommy started spending time with an older man named Willis Clark. According to Tommy, his mother had no issue with Willis taking advantage of and molesting him, even encouraging the abuse. When Tommy was only 10 years old, he stopped going to school. Instead, he spent most of his time partaking in drugs and alcohol, and his life began to take a heavy downward turn. There was an incident a few years later when he was 13 years old where he took off all of his clothes and hopped into his grandmother's bed while she slept. He wanted to achieve some sort of sexual gratification. After Tommy's out-of-control behavior, he was kicked out of the house and banned from ever returning. Shortly after, Tommy's mother and his own siblings up and left town without warning, leaving Tommy homeless and responsible for fending for himself. For the next 20 years, Tommy was essentially on his own. He found ways to support with small gigs here and there, but he never kept a job for very long. He spent most of his adult life until that point hopping from town to town and never stayed in one area longer than he had to. He would jump onto trains or hitch rides with random people who saw him standing on the side of the road. And along the way, he would commit many crimes and was thrown in jail multiple times. Tommy claims to have committed his first murder when he was just 16 years old. After breaking into a home, he witnessed an older man taking advantage of a young boy. He claimed to have pulled out a gun and shot the man on sight. However, this is still unconfirmed. In May of 1981, Tommy met up with the family who abandoned him. He traveled down to Little Rock, Arkansas, but wasn't allowed to stay in the home very long. He took off his clothes and attempted to walk into the shower that his mother was using, again, as a way to find some sick sexual satisfaction. She kicked him out of the house, and again, he was banned from returning. Although he did try to seek treatment, it didn't work, and it wasn't to the level he needed. His behavior became out of control. While working at a carnival in 1985, Tommy met a 28-year-old woman named Ina and her 4-year-old son, Rory. The woman and Tommy hit it off, and after some flirty conversation, she invited him to come and stay at her place for the evening. The two slept together, and according to Tommy, after they were done, she started to snoop through his bag, attempting to steal from him. Tommy snuck into her son's room, grabbed a baseball bat, and beat Ina and her son to death. A few days later, both Ina and Rory's bodies were found, but by the time they were discovered, Tommy was nowhere to be found. He had hopped on a train and fled to another state. In 1987, Tommy drugged and strangled a woman named Stephanie. He proceeded to dump her body into a hot spring located in the desert after encasing her feet in concrete. I mean, that's some mob stuff right there. While in New York, Tommy took the life of a 27-year-old woman named Suzanne. Then, while hitchhiking throughout Illinois, Tommy was picked up by a man named Keith Dardine. Keith invited Tommy back to his house to share dinner with the family, as he could see that Tommy was in need of food and company. As soon as they walked through the door, Tommy pulled out a gun, shooting Keith in the head twice. He then proceeded to castrate him and shot him once more. Peter, Keith's son, saw what happened, and sadly, Tommy took a baseball bat and beat him to death. He turned to Keith's pregnant wife, Elaine, and attacked her, and the beating caused her to go into labor. The child was born prematurely, and Tommy beat the newborn child as well. He then took advantage of Elaine, mutilated her, took advantage of her unalive body, and fled the scene. I apologize if that was graphic. It was really hard to describe, but this man was pure evil. His intention was to kill them because he wanted a thrill. He found pleasure in seeing other people suffer, a truly disgusting individual. In 1990, Tommy was sentenced to 16 months in jail for stealing a car in Wyoming. While there, he received a diagnosis of antisocial, borderline personality disorder, as well as bipolar disorder, psychosis, and major depressive disorder. He was untreated and unmedicated, but spent most of his days drinking or taking drugs to numb his mental and emotional pain. Shortly after his release, he traveled to West Virginia and stood on the street corner with a sign asking for change and food. In 1992, a young 19-year-old woman named Fabienne, out of the kindness of her heart, picked him up and drove him to her house to feed him. He stayed in her car while she ran inside. Of course, Tommy had other ideas on his mind and stormed inside her house. He grabbed a knife, held her hostage, and tried to take advantage of her sexually. Fabienne fought for her life. She grabbed a ceramic decorative duck and repeatedly smashed it into his head. Somehow, she managed to take the knife from Tommy and sliced his kidney, liver, and one of his testicles. Full of rage, Tommy took a stool and beat her over the head. She was left with a major gash on her head, but thankfully survived after surgery. As for Tommy, he landed in the emergency room because of his wounds. He was charged and served 5 years in prison for his crimes. Yet again, another person who just wanted to help. Tommy didn't know how to accept love, much less show it to other people. Surprisingly enough, though, Tommy found love while in prison. He married a woman named Nora Price, and after he was released in 1997, he traveled to Tennessee to live with her. I assume that leading a normal, non-violent life was too boring for Tommy, and he quickly became bored. As soon as the two moved in together, Tommy left and continued traveling. Shortly after leaving his wife Nora, Tommy went back to his life of violent crime. On October 13th, 1997, while traveling through Illinois, he killed a 10-year-old boy named Joel. And Joel's own mother was actually convicted of his murder. He quickly made his way out of Illinois and into Missouri. And just 2 days after killing Joel, Tommy found a 13-year-old girl named Stephanie Mahaney and killed her, close to Springfield. He proceeded to take the lives of 2 other people in the following 2 years. One, a 9-year-old child named Mary Beatrice Perez. The other was a 14-year-old child named Haley McCone, who he also assaulted before murdering her. The final crime of our story today involves 13-year-old Katie Harris, 10-year-old Krystal Surles, and 7-year-old Mark Surles. On New Year's Eve night, 1999, in Del Rio, Texas, Krystal and Mark showed up at Katie Harris's house for a sleepover. Krystal and Mark's parents were traveling through Kansas, and instead of staying at the house alone, they thought a sleepover would be fun and safe. That night, Mark was told to sleep in the room with a single bed, while Krystal and Katie shared a room with a bunk bed. Mark was furious. She felt like the annoying younger sibling left out of all the fun New Year's Eve celebrations. After the hype died down, everyone went to sleep. Just then, at around 3:50 a.m., Krystal woke up in the top bunk to the sound of a scream. She saw a man with long, dark, scruffy hair and a long, bushy beard standing at the end of her bed. Tommy Lynn Sells had broken into Katie Harris's home, walked into her room, and began attacking her. While she did fight back, she was overpowered by the grown man and his knife, and she was stabbed over 16 times. Tommy hadn't realized that Krystal was sleeping in the top bunk. Just as he went to turn off the lights, he turned around and saw 10-year-old Krystal staring back at him. He rushed over to the top bunk and slit her throat. He proceeded to turn off the lights and close the door behind him. Krystal climbed down to Katie, who was gasping for air. Krystal tried to speak, but she couldn't due to her throat injury. And she believed that the man had gone after everyone in the house and she needed to get help immediately. It was truly a life or death situation. Krystal, hands around her throat, walked over a quarter mile to the closest house. She banged on the door, unable to speak, but could write notes. The police made it to the house, and Krystal continued to speak to them through her notepad, begging them to hurry and save the Harris family. Sadly, Katie didn't survive because her wounds were too severe. They rushed her to the hospital, and despite having a sliced trachea, Krystal survived. Over a few days, she managed to work with the police and sketch artists. And within days, Tommy had been arrested and charged for his murder of Katie and attempted murder of Krystal. During the trial, Krystal took the stand and testified against Tommy. Can you believe a child as young as she was brave enough to face him again? He was found guilty and sentenced to death. This is where he confessed to many of the other crimes he committed, explaining that he had harmed over 70 people. In April of 2014, Tommy died by lethal injection in Texas. The Harris family, the Perez family, and Krystal Surles all attended. That is the end of our story. And what did you all think of this one? I can't believe that it took so long to finally put this man behind bars, but because of Krystal's fight to stay alive and her bravery to testify against him, he finally lost. Thank you all so much for watching this episode, and if you want to watch some more, feel free to check out the Killer Bites page. Until next time, see you later.